There are few things that stir up our imagination like the penny farthing. You know, the high wheel, the high wheeler, the ordinary, a symbol of the late Victorian period, a time where we had top hats and moustaches and tails. A very different time. But you look at this thing now and you think, what kind of planet were these people on? Who thought that this was a good idea? Now, the name penny farthing was coined. I mean, that's shameful. Who wrote this? I did. It was nicknamed on account of the fact that the front wheel looked like a penny and the rear looked like a farthing. The name stuck. And it's a very good one, but it's also believed that this name was only used at a later time when this machine was virtually obsolete. It was a nickname that came around at a later stage of its life. Now, even though this machine reached its peak popularity and was only really around for about 20 years, ended in about 1890, this was a special machine, not only because it was iconic, not only because of its amazing silhouette, but this was the first iteration of the bicycle. Was it seen as a success when it was invented? Yes. But for many obvious reasons, it was also seen as a failure. A successful failure. The high-wheel bicycle was invented in Paris by Eugene Meyer in and around the late 1860s. He is the notable inventor who didn't receive the credit he deserved in the early years, but his invention of this machine not only made it a feasible idea, but also kick-started the development of the bicycle. He competed with this bicycle first in 1869 in the Paris-Rouen race, which was one of the first city-to-city races, and then in 1870 he brought the bicycle to England and competed with it in Wolverhampton. This is how the bicycle caught the attention of acclaimed inventor James Starley, who used this format and this template of the big wheel, in the process establishing the British cycling industry, introducing all sorts of improvements like a larger front wheel and solid rubber tires for comfort and increased speed. Ball bearings were used inside the pedals for mobility, and most famously tangent spokes on the bicycle rim. Eugene at this time actually owned the patent to spoked rims. Starley also made the process of climbing on and getting off this bike a lot easier, using pegs at the back of the bike, pushing with one leg to get momentum and then climbing onto the saddle. Now, the atmosphere of cycling back then, we must know, was very different. Since these machines were not readily available, not everyone could afford them. These bespoke items, which were hand-built, custom-made, were solely reserved for city living men who were wealthy. And we could in many ways see that this machine, this penny farthing in the late 1800s, was considered a status symbol in many ways. It's not a stretch of the imagination to think that if we saw people riding these around in the city, it would be the talk of the town. And the introduction of the bicycle as it became a more mass-produced product perfectly intersected and coincided with the start of the cycling craze and the cycling industry. On that front alone, the penny farthing became symbolic. Let's break down the design of this early bicycle and ask, why was it constructed this way? What was the point of the big wheel? There were two main benefits. We laugh at this sort of technology today because it does seem a little bit extreme and out there. We should also remember that since this was the very infancy of cycling, no one knew about the context. There were very few innovations in this area. The entire landscape hadn't been established yet, and there was no understanding about cycling and when it would be applicable. It was all still just a guessing game. If we look at the typical Parisian or Victorian main street back then, well, it was filled with buggies and horse-drawn carriages, and these were tall, elevated off the ground, made viewing very difficult. Similar to side streets and sidewalks, lots of people and foot traffic. So the thought to elevate the rider above the height of these objects, to have a better view, a better peripheral view of their surroundings, was a great idea. The rider was able to see over the typical traffic, and it made for a great option when moving around town. And today we see the same taken into account where people buy SUVs, mainly for freeway driving. And this extra height means that you can see further ahead of you while traveling on the roads. So the main benefit was elevation, being able to see above traffic. The next benefit of the big wheel was mechanical advantage, since of course these machines didn't use gears, they didn't use chain drive, they didn't use internal 3-speed hubs or any of that technology yet. A small rotation of legs around a big wheel would mean that you would have many more revolutions per second. Basically, the big wheel allowed for a more comfortable ride. The bigger size allowed for greater shock absorption. It also meant that you could travel further without using more energy. It also means that the big wheel could move extremely fast if you increased your pedaling. A great bike for racing. And we must remember that this was the original template. This was first conceived as a racing bike. So the second main benefit was added comfort and a lot less energy usage while pedaling. But we look at this thing as a death trap, and yeah, it totally was. Odds are you would spend more time off the bike than you did on it. Since you're sitting on this machine's point of balance with the handlebars directly below you, steering and making tight turns is difficult, and you can't slow down easily. And if you were to hit any piece of debris, you would continue going in the direction you were moving, which is forwards. More often than not, you would be landing on your face from the height of 5 feet, maybe even more. The term doing a header became commonplace, and if you planned on bombing down a hill, you would take your feet off the pedals and put your legs over the handlebars, so that if you were to come off the bike, you would land on your feet first before inevitably slamming on your face. So imagine seeing these machines at the peak of their popularity being ridden around all over the place. It must have been an amazing sight, but the acrobatics must have been even better to watch on a daily basis. Later examples of these bicycle handlebars were designed with a moustache shape, which allowed for your knees to clear them. Then the invention of the Watton handlebars that also showed promise. And these were, wouldn't you believe, some of the early templates of racing handlebars that are so recognizable today. So at least then you could land on your feet and not bring the bike down on top of you. I mean, that's a bonus. It's safe to say that these gadgets were health hazards. But with its shortcomings, these early bicycles were mechanically sound. A fairly simple, relatively lightweight cast iron frame with barely any moving parts. And these machines may have been dangerous, but they didn't fail. More often than not, it was human error that caused the accidents. Back then, and even today, people ride these for thousands of miles and never experience issues with them. But the penny-farthing became functionally obsolete not 10 years after the height of its popularity. And by the late 1890s, we saw two innovations that made the greatest difference and changed the bicycle world forever. Chain drive and pneumatic tires, invented by John Dunlop. Yes, Dunlop tires. The chain allowing for easy pedaling and ratios shared between the gears and the legs. And the tires that can now be filled with air made them far more comfortable and eliminated the need for a larger wheel to absorb shocks and bumps. By 1890, the early generation of the penny-farthing bicycle was phased out in favor of the Rover safety bicycle. Safety because the wheels were the same size, and if you were to come off, you wouldn't be falling 5 feet to the ground. But from then until this day, the penny-farthing has always been seen as a recreational and fun challenge to ride. Over 100 years later, and there still are enthusiasts who love riding and racing them because they are so different, because they offer a different frame of reference, and they reconnect us with an older time. This bizarre machine lets us imagine what the world was like back then, and seeing them move even to this day, it's so captivating. Just like back then, they don't fail to turn heads, with such an odd and simple design that lets us question the ingenuity of the time. And in a world today where the bicycle is commonplace, where whole cultures rely on them daily, seeing how it began, it's clear that the statement it made when it arrived on the scene can still be felt.